please be seated. But no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. We're taught from a very young age that words and actions are qualitatively different. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But any of us who have experienced the sting of words, the pain of a breakup, the verbal jab that hits right where you're the most vulnerable and insecure, a word of betrayal, or simply dismissal. Anyone who's experienced those things knows that childhood saying isn't true. Being told that we're not enough, that we don't matter, that what we say isn't valuable. The pain of words can last as long, if not longer, than any physical injury. And they have the power to shape how we see ourselves and understand our place in the world. Words are a powerful tool and can be a powerful weapon. They're one of the fundamental ways that we connect with one another. One of the ways through our shared language we're able to build community, to relate, to connect, to build relationships. They're a vehicle for our shared humanity. But words can also be used to strip that same humanity away and to justify the worst ways that we treat one another. One of the most dangerous ways that words can be used is to take away or diminish the humanity of another person. This is a sociological process called dehumanization. And it happens whenever one group gives a label to another group that allows that first group to see the other as less than human, as less than themselves. This process of dehumanization has often been used to justify any number of acts of violence, cruelty, hatred. In the 1100s and throughout the Middle Ages, the doctrine of discovery was a doctrine established by the church and by civic governments. They granted Europeans rights over any lands they discovered. It labeled the indigenous peoples of those lands as savages, and by doing so stripped them of their humanity, their rights, their ability to be seen and treated as people. And that same doctrine led to genocide against American Indians and justified the enslavement of Africans. And while the words that people have used to describe others have changed over time, that process continues, that process of dehumanization. Think about our own American context, that the word slave was used to describe the enslaved Africans brought over to these shores. And that word brought with it the connotation that they were more property than human beings. That word was used to justify all kinds of ill treatment, to see them as being less than human. And then this cycle replicates itself time and again. In the 19th century, it was anti-immigrant sentiment that generated whole vocabularies of dehumanization, that rendered Italians, Chinese people, Polish people, Japanese immigrants as a sort of underclass to the Anglo settlers who preceded them. That process again comes up in the 20th century. And think of Nazi Germany, where Hitler referred to Jews explicitly as subhumans or rats. Or in America, in the McCarthy era, anyone advocating a strong social safety net was labeled a commie and either silenced or imprisoned. The words and groups that are targeted change, but the process and the effect remains the same. And this week I again think about September 11th, 2001, and how to the hijackers of those planes We, the American people, were infidels. And that label, that dehumanizing label, justified their act of violence. And I think of what our nation later did, using the word terrorists to apply to whole swaths of people from other parts of the world, justifying imprisonment, violence against, denying them the fundamental human rights that we have come to know as a nation. The words and labels change, but the process is the same. And I see that dehumanizing language running through our present political and cultural discourse, being applied from and towards people on all sides. Whether those are labels like fascist or social justice warrior or any number of these sort of buzzwords that have risen up and come to become a stand-in for whole groups of people. These words get thrown around without caution, used as a way to offhandedly dismiss a person or group. Instead of seeing those other people as human beings, these words are used as a way to avoid dialogue, to avoid actual engagement, to escape having to come to find any sort of mutual understanding or appreciation of nuance. The tendency to dehumanize is deep in our social DNA. It's how our Paleolithic ancestors survived to pass on their genes. It was a survival mechanism. But in our present moment, it's the source of some of the greatest rifts in our collective social fabric, and that it's responsible for so much fracturing of our society. That dehumanization happens on all sides and springs from closed-minded societies and unwillingness to hear and value the experience of others. In our reading from the Epistle of James, the writer warns of the danger of words. The tongue is a fire. It has the power to consume. With it we bless the Lord and Father, James writes, and with it we curse those who are made in likeness of God. The writer calls out the sort of doublespeak at the heart of any effort to dehumanize one another. The labels we use to dismiss one another's, cast them out of the sphere of moral reckoning, and allow us to maintain our own sense of integrity while putting others down. James reminds his readers that to follow Christ demands a different approach to how we speak to one another. How we communicate is part and parcel with how we act, how we treat each other. Speech and action are one. He compares the tongue to a rudder, capable of guiding the whole body, the whole ship of ourselves, directing our every action. And so how we treat one another begins with how we speak to and about each other. Words have power. They have the power to build up or to tear down. With them, we can invite others in, to invite them with us to draw closer to God, to build community and build relationship. Or with them, we can tear each other down, sever connection, and put distance between ourselves and our neighbors. James's line about blessing God at the same time that we curse those made in the likeness of God is a warning against the dehumanizing language of his own day. Jesus himself bore the label of criminal, and the Jewish authorities used that label to justify his eventual crucifixion. That and similar labels were affixed to Jesus' followers and used as justification for persecuting them. The small and fragile community of Christians to whom James was writing would have been very aware of the danger of words and what impact dehumanizing language can have. But James also realizes the potential for the tongue to be a force for good, a tool through which the love of God is revealed in and to the world. I go back to that image he uses of the tongue as a fire. And fire can, on one hand, consume and destroy whatever it touches. But fire is also a tool that can be harnessed and utilized. When used properly, fire is what powers our society. From the food we eat to how we heat our homes, to the ways that electricity has been generated for decades, centuries. That same force that can destroy can also create and empower. James is inviting us to consider this generative potential of how we speak to one another. How can we use our words to build one another up, to strengthen our communities, and to build relationships across lines of difference? In her writing on dehumanization, the sociologist and author Brené Brown offers a contrasting paradigm. Because so many time-worn systems of power have placed certain people outside the realm of what we see as human, she writes, much of our work now is a matter of rehumanizing. And that starts in the same place dehumanizing starts, with words and images. This rehumanizing that she describes is a process by which we shift our language and open it up to respecting the dignity of other human beings who, like us, are made in the image and likeness of God. I think of some of the movements in our country that are doing the work of rehumanization. I think of the core of what the Black Lives Matter movement started as. What it holds as its central tenet, that Black Lives Matter. That isn't a statement meant to exclude or put down others, but is meant to affirm and rehumanize those who have experienced dehumanization in our nation's past. I think about other movements. I think about circles in which language has moved away from talking about the poor or the homeless to talking about people experiencing poverty, people experiencing homelessness. That both of those things aren't an identity, but simply an attribute, a temporary state. Or moving away from the label of criminal, convict, felon, and towards describing incarcerated or formerly incarcerated persons. That's a step towards rehumanization. So is moving away from talking about illegal aliens to talking about people seeking asylum, people who immigrating to this country. To use this people-centered language reshapes and rehumanizes how we have these conversations, how we see the other. And those linguistic shifts may seem subtle, part of this new lexicon that's overly cautious and overly sensitive. But our words have impact. Those labels that have been used to relegate people to the status of second-class citizens, those labels have impact. But using this person-centered language is an important step towards acknowledging our shared humanity and towards countering violence that has been committed against people belonging to marginalized groups. I see all of this connecting to our gospel reading as well. In our reading from Mark, Jesus foretells the suffering that he will face. He warns his disciples of the road that lies ahead, the journey that will culminate in the cross. The way of the cross is the way of rehumanization. By accepting the fate that will be handed to him and suffering for the world out of love, Jesus breaks the power of the forces of dehumanization that would seek to strip him of his humanity, of his identity. He takes all of that onto himself to render it ineffective. Jesus' life, death, and ministry are all about restoring and redeeming humanity, reaffirming that all of us are created in the image and likeness of God. Jesus' mission, and that we take on as followers of Christ, is all about rehumanization. It's about moving beyond the labels and words that harm and denigrate and towards the kind of language that builds connection. To follow in the way of the cross means loving all people. And in order to love all people, we must first see and speak about our neighbors as humans, not reducing them to buzzwords or offhandedly dismissing them. how great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. My prayer for us today is that we may harness that fire for good, that our words may reflect the love of God that burns in our hearts. May we be mindful of how we speak, and through our words may the dignity of every human being, created in the image and likeness of God, be respected and affirmed. May these words be more than words. May we follow Jesus in the way of the cross. Amen.